Our credit rating in November and December, there is the possibility that we could slide down into sub-investment grade or so-called junk status. This could make the cost of borrowing even higher. Already, South Africa spends about 12 cents of every 1 rand in tax revenue that comes in just to cover the interest charges on our current debt. Earlier, my colleague Nompu Siziba spoke to Gardner Rusike, an associate director at S&P. She asked him if the finance minister had done enough to avert a downgrade.
The minister attempted to maintain the path of fiscal consolidation in an environment of low economic growth. So you could see from the revision of growth numbers being weaker that it had an impact on the fiscal trajectory. And we are still seeing fiscal consolidation broadly on track, but at a less pace than government envisaged in the February budget. But beyond the fiscal numbers, we would also have expected to see a little bit of more detail, which is more of a progress report on the economic reforms that government said they want to do, as well as the reforms around the SOEs that they have also said they want to do to reduce the contingent liabilities to the state.
In terms of the SOEs you just touched on, what do you think really needs to be done to turn them around? Because obviously they are a little bit of a liability, as you say.
Yeah, okay. So it's not necessarily for us to indicate what should be done with SOEs to place them in a financially sustainable position, but what we mention is if the risks coming from the state-owned enterprises requiring extended guarantees from the Treasury, requiring capital injections, if these exceed particular levels, then they will impact the fiscal metrics. So whatever government does, we take that and put it into a credit opinion rather than doing direct policy advice. And
I mean, of course, it might be tricky for you to comment on this, but we are possibly going to be pursuing a nuclear deal. There's talk of it costing around R1 trillion over a number of years. The economist that we just spoke to now says he doesn't think South Africa can afford it. Assuming that we begin to get metrics for those, how would you view that deal?
Yeah, okay. So our current assumptions, the nuclear plan, as far as the big financing is concerned, is not currently part of the fiscal plan. Right? If it were to be on the fiscal plan, which is government's policy choice, that's fair enough. But for us is to understand what are the implications on the fiscal plan. As long as it does not deviate from the current consolidation plan, then it should be consistent with the credit metrics. Where it weakens the fiscal plan and changes the fiscal stance, resulting in seeing higher budget deficits and no stabilization of debt, that could negatively impact on the credit metrics that we look at.
One worries about the fact that the finance minister will be looking to raise 13 billion rand next year or in the 2017-2018 fiscal year, given the fact that we have very high unemployment, we have a very low tax base, and obviously that's going to put more pressure on households that are earning an income and so on. So the concern is that we may end up actually falling into a low growth trap or even into recessionary territory. So how do you balance that against obviously fiscal consolidation?
Yeah, so I think Treasury has some options that they are looking at, that they are considering it. I think, for example, we have seen that in this current fiscal year, there's been a revenue gap for plus minus 20 billion rand. Next year, you are seeing that similar revenue gap. In order to close that, I think they've done some expenditure adjustments, so which mitigates the deficit. All right, so you're looking at probably half of that. So those are the options. But if you look at that, the economy is weak, and the revenue drivers that have been slow include your VAT and personal income taxes. So, I mean, it's a difficult balancing act because you're putting pressures on already strained consumers. So I think for us, it's up to the Treasury in terms of looking at the options that they can look at, but it's then what does it mean for the actual outcomes in terms of projections, for the deficits and the stabilization of debt. So I think South Africa has gone through a period that they did expansionary fiscal policy, expanded expenditure and so forth. So we are in that time where we're supposed to see the counter-cyclical fiscal policy in place, and it's up to the authorities to see how they maneuver that and how they can deliver that, and that credit metrics do not deteriorate any further.
And lastly, Gardner, there's been a lot of speculation in the country about political tensions at the very top of the country. To what extent does S&P monitor this and consider this in its review?
Yeah, no, politics is very important when we assess the institutional assessment. The strength of institutions is dependent on the governance issues, the political dynamics, and so forth. And I think for South Africa, we've been very clear, at least in the last 6 to 12 months, that political dynamics which have come into the fray negatively impacting policy choices, and they can negatively impact on the outcomes. So for the kind of reforms that we're looking at, these can be derailed by the political dynamics. So it's important that at government level, we could see that executive cohesion, even within the party, that the country continues to be united rather than playing some of these public debates in the media. It reduces the social contract that government has with business, and it reduces the business confidence that you're looking for, and you will not get that investment, and growth may remain weak in such kind of a scenario.
All right, let's get some more reaction to